Hi, I'm Matt McManus. I'm a professor of politics and international relations at Tech de Monterrey. And I'm also the editor of What is Postmodern Conservatism? Essays on Our Mutually Tremendous Time, which was released just this January. And I'm also one of the authors of our forthcoming book, Myth and Mayhem, A Leftist Critique of Jordan Peterson, along with my fellow co-authors, Ben Burgess, Marian Trejo, Conrad Hamilton, and very excited to say also Slavoj Žižek, who wrote the introduction for our book. One of the things that I get asked probably more often than anything else is whether or not I think Jordan Peterson is what I call in the first book a postmodern conservative. And I understand why people would be kind of interested in this question. He talks a lot about identity, and while he's highly critical of left-wing identity politics, Peterson does certainly stress the need to build collective and shared identities based around traditions and values in order to hold society together in the 21st century. Peterson is also very prone to evoking a kind of epistemic pragmatism, which is consistent with that of other postmodern figures like Richard Rorty, who argued that we shouldn't necessarily look at our concepts of the world as providing us with an objective truth so much as being useful tools for analyzing the kind of horizons of experience that we have. But I'm actually going to argue that Peterson isn't a postmodern conservative, and that's because I think he fits much more comfortably in a modernist conservative tradition that goes back to the late 19th century and the early 20th century. And this is true also, it's worth noting, of his theoretical predecessors. People like Carl Jung, Martin Heidegger, Friedrich Nietzsche all had a right-of-center bent to their analyses of modernity that carries over into Peterson's work and his kind of bizarre defense points of kind of Christian ordered liberty type support for capitalism, neoliberal capitalism in particular. The reason that I characterize Peterson as belonging to this modernist conservative tradition is some of these figures actually have very interesting things to say, and personally I think Peterson does as well. Modernist conservative critics would point out how in our contemporary era we're starting to see a breakdown of traditions and values that once provided a great deal of solidarity and cohesion to our communities. And of course, being conservatives, they're highly disturbed by this development. They tend to like order and stability, and this kind of forebodes the emergence of chaos. And some of these conservative critics, I think, actually do have a great deal of insights to offer the left. Nobody's going to sit there and saying that there's nothing to learn from Nietzsche or even from fascists like Martin Heidegger, as long as you deal with their work carefully. I think there are things that progressives can take from Peterson's work too. When he talks about the need for solidaristic attachments, that's not the word he uses, but I think this is accurate, to hold people together, I actually think that that's something that the left can get behind. I think that if you develop strong solidaristic attachments in your community, that can inspire neoliberal subjects to look outside of themselves and try to demonstrate a level of care and concern for the other in a manner that's actually really consistent with our egalitarian ambitions as progressives. Where I think the modernist conservative critics went wrong, and where I think Peterson himself really goes off the rails at points, is in how carefully they try to insulate their own sacred cows from criticism, because that would actually entail looking in depth at various features of our society that they want to conserve, but which I think and other progressives would argue actually contributed a great deal, if not almost everything, to the emergence of the kind of breakdown in values and traditions that many of these conservative figures are so concerned about. And I think there are a couple of good examples of this. Peterson is very famous for his defense of neoliberal capitalism in the 21st century. He often takes a kind of Pinker-esque line that, well, things have been getting better and better for a long time. We see economic growth consistently increasing. Why would anybody try to criticize this system? And there are many different ways that you can criticize this. One of the things that people point out, like Amartya Sen, is that a growing economy isn't necessarily the only thing that we have to be concerned about. We also have to look at how that growth is distributed. It doesn't matter if the pie gets bigger, if a smaller and smaller proportion of it, both in absolute or even in relative terms, is going to a majority of the people and all the rest is going to capital. But I think more foundationally what Peterson misses is the transformative role that capital played in upending the traditions and values that he takes to be so important. Marx and Engels had a very famous expression in the Communist Manifesto where they said that all that is solid melts into the air with the advent of liberal capitalism in the 19th century. And I think that's about as succinct and beautiful summation of postmodern culture as you could possibly give. And I think what you see with the emergence of neoliberalism in the 20th and now 21st century as a global hegemonic order is an economic imperative to break down traditions and traditional ways of life and to upend their values in order to make way for the power of capital and the commodification of all areas of what's sometimes called the life world. You can think of many different examples of this, the way that capital has entered into huge numbers of developing countries and broken down traditional barriers, particularly traditional indigenous barriers to the market. Think about, the policies of somebody like Augusto Pinochet in Chile, all the anti-Aboriginal indigenous policies that he implemented in order to kind of make Chile into the ideal neoliberal state. And of course, you can also see this in the developed world, where all of us individual subjects are told that we shouldn't necessarily try to form solidaristic attachments with other people, because we need first and foremost to see ourselves as competitors and entrepreneurs who are in a very, very, very tough environment, all trying to get to the top of the pecking order. This, of course, has a really corrosive effect on our attachments to one another, and who in these kind of conditions are actually going to dedicate themselves to these kind of solidaristic attachments and preserving them if we're all trying to compete to get to the top of a very competitive hierarchy, which of course is something Peterson almost always talks about as a good thing, whereas I think it's quite a bad thing, and I think he would too if he actually paid more attention to these problems and bothered to read Karl Marx rather than just kind of talking about these bizarre neologisms like postmodern neo-Marxism. And the weird irony about all this development is there are some conservative critics who fall into the modernist paradigm who are way more aware of this than I think Peterson is, and that includes people like Nietzsche and Martin Heidegger. Heidegger's famous expression was that, to his mind at least, capitalism and socialism were metaphysically the same, and he was talking about Soviet state capitalism there, because both were just committed to a materialist competitive outlook on life, materialist competitive metaphysics, if you will. Now, I disagree with that to a certain extent, but it is a provocative idea that Peterson just ignores when he's appropriating somebody like Heidegger to try to use him to justify the contemporary status quo. So this is why I think we shouldn't necessarily characterize Peterson as a postmodern conservative. I think he really comfortably fits in this modernist conservative paradigm, but he doesn't exist at the upper echelons of that paradigm, because he's really resistant to actually applying his own reasoning consistently, where that would mean interrogating a lot of the features of the contemporary status quo that he thinks are important, particularly the impact of capitalism on traditionalism in communities. The weird kind of situation we're in is we need to do the job of many conservative critics better than they're willing to do that. They are willing and interested in engaging in a critique of the contemporary status quo as long as it preserves the hierarchies and capitalist systems that they happen to benefit from or happen to think are valuable. What I say a radical critique needs to do is actually take these issues seriously and recognize the role they've had in generating what really is an unwholesome, highly competitive, and highly unequal condition of neoliberal postmodernity.